Thank you very much. And we are so happy to have you all this afternoon in Central Time, morning in US, and maybe late afternoon in India and other part of Asia. We are happy to have you in the last day of the CEDIL conference, and those who have been part of this session for the past 3 days. You have seen the need and you have heard the need for the use of evidence, during changing environment that we are facing globally. COVID have taught us a lot of things about the need for policymakers and practitioners to use evidence. CEDIL have worked over the years and produce a lot of evidence-based decision-making products. And we have learned a lot of lessons through evidence generation, evidence synthesis, and evidence uptake. Today, we are going to work with different members of the CEDIL, team. And we are going to talk about what we have learned about supporting the use of innovative methods to generate evidence. What we have learned over the years that on the use of evidence methods to generate evidence. Today we have 4 panelists who are going to join us, and I would love for them to introduce themselves. So we will start with Sean. Sean, you will introduce yourself, and then we go to Howard, Eduardo, and Radhika. Good.
Thank you, David. So good afternoon, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I am Sian Rasdale. As the agenda says, I was until about a week and a half ago the head of global science in the FCDO, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I have just moved post, very excitingly, to be the new chief statistician in FCDO. As some of you will know, I was involved in CEDIL when I headed up DFID's evaluation unit a few years ago. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. We will go to Howard White.
Thank you, David. So it's good to see so many people here joining the last session of the CEDIL conference for this week. So I'm Howard White, I'm the Research Director for CEDIL.
Good, thank you very much. Eduardo?
Yes, hi everyone, and my name is Eduardo Masset. I'm the Deputy Director of CEDIL.
Good, thank you very much. And Radhika?
Hello everyone, lovely to be here. I'm Radhika Menon. I'm the Research Uptake Lead for CEDIL, and I lead the evidence use technical community at Oxford Policy Management.
Thank you very much. We are happy to have you all, and you are welcome. And what our panelists are going to do is that they will give 8 minutes presentation, and then we will have an audience poll, and that will be led by Howard White, and then the result will be presented by Sean. After that, we will take your questions and answers. As Sean have said, as Saul have said, please use the Q&A, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, to put your questions or comments in, so that the panelists, you can either address it to a particular panelist, or you can make it a general, and then a panelist will take it. And then I will wrap up by giving the closing remark. We are going to spend a lively, interactive, and exciting 1.5 hours in this conference. So we welcome you all, and we hope that you will really follow and note what we have learned, in supporting the use of innovative method to generate evidence. So thank you very much, and we go to Howard. Howard, please, you are mute. Howard, you have to unmute.
Okay.
Thank you,
David. So thank you, David. So Eduardo and I have slightly longer than the 20 minutes total for the two of us, but we won't. It's a bit over the 8 minutes. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give an overview of what CEDIL is and what it's achieved. Most of you on the call probably are aware of CEDIL, which probably wouldn't be here, but it's very helpful to go back and actually say what CEDIL set out to do and assess the extent to which we've achieved that, because probably a lot of you have come to know CEDIL more recently and are not aware of its beginnings. In fact, the beginnings were that there was two attempts by DFID as it was to let a contract for something like CEDIL, and the first attempt didn't result in a contract being awarded. So this was the second attempt. So it's an idea that's been around since 2012, 2013 at least, but finally only came to fruition some time later. So we have here the list of CEDIL's goals as set out in the call for proposals to bid for CEDIL, and in our proposal to run CEDIL. And so you see there, develop and test methods of evaluation and evidence synthesis, fill evidence gaps, and promote use of evidence in FCDO and other agencies. And so in our own proposal, we transferred that to 4 separate gaps that CEDIL was intended to fill. So one was geographic and sector gaps, to fund studies where no study has gone before, in terms of just there aren't many studies in that country or in that sector. So don't do health, for example, was explicitly stated, because there's lots of studies in health already. To have innovations to support gaps in impact evaluation methods. So the intention was not to be RCT oriented, but to say, well, what are the evaluation questions that can't be asked by current methods? Can we identify methods that can help answer those questions? And then similar thing for evidence synthesis, innovative evidence synthesis methods to answer questions not being addressed by current methods going back 6-7 years, and also knowledge translation gaps. That it's well recognized, continues to be recognized, that we need to make sure that research evidence gets into use to inform policy practice, project program design and policy, and so how can we fill that knowledge translation gap? So there's 4 gaps, and here's my rocket diagram that shows that the structure that CEDIL had, and this was key to our proposal, that CEDIL would have a structured approach across time where the end results of CEDIL were dependent upon the earlier stages of the research. So it was a carefully structured research program. So CEDIL was made up of different consortium members. So the London International Development Centre is the host, and that included then London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Epicenter, UCL, 3IE and Campbell collaboration with the 5 consortium members. And the consortium members will work on pre-inception papers. We're at the sharp end of the rocket, at the top and front now. We're to the left. We've produced 4 pre-inception papers, and those pre-inception papers would start to think about ideas of what CEDIL could do, would inform 12 inception papers, which would go into more depth into particular areas of analysis were deemed promising after the discussion of the pre-inception papers. We did the pre-inception papers, had a workshop where they were presented, discussed what emerged out and it seemed interesting. That led to the commissioning of the 12 inception papers, which led to another workshop, which led to the identifying the programs of work we were going to commission. And I'll say a bit more about that. Then we commissioned sets of studies, and I'll say a bit more about those as well. Finally, the tails of the rocket, lessons learned papers and evidence synthesis papers, were end of project products that were meant to summarize what we'd learned. Lessons learned papers being around the methods we'd used, what did we learn about the methods that we'd identified as innovative and what we learned about those, and evidence synthesis being summarizing the evidence from these clusters of where there had been gaps in evidence. What can we say about summarizing there's new studies we've funded and other studies in that area by doing a systematic review. So there's a logical structure there, which, and I guess, you know, the main achievement of CEDIL was that we did that. Basically, we did what we said we were going to do, and it's an ambitious program when you think about it, to have this quite tightly structured program of research. That bits fell off along the way, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And because, of course, there was COVID, there were rate cuts and so on, so bits fell off. But by and large, CEDIL has been a structured research program, has delivered on that structure, and CEDIL shows the benefits of having a multi-year structured research program, and being just over 5 years long allowed us to do that, to have this structure. We'd had a 2-year program with funding uncertainty. We could have never taken this phased approach to saying, let's think about the issues, let's identify the approaches, and then let's do a call for proposals, people to come in and put in proposals to fund grants, to do research that informs innovation in methods, both for reviews and impact evaluations, but also for use evidence. So we had the dozen inception papers, actually more than, I think there were 14 in the end, and the pre-inception papers, and we had a workshop which consisted of authors of the papers. We had something called the intellectual leadership team. Sounds very grandiose and pretentious, but it was DFID's term, not ours. So we're the intellectual leaders in the field, and with the intellectual leadership team, many of them really are that. So I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about other people we had in the team. And we came together in a workshop where we discussed the papers and presented them, the findings were presented, and we identified possible themes where we got clusters, we identified clusters, and from that came 4 possible, what we called programs of work, for which we would commission studies. And they were evaluating complexity, enhancing transferability of study findings, use of evidence were the 3 programs of work we funded. A 4th proposed program of work on timely evaluation was rejected by DFID because they had another agency, a project they were funding to work on timely evaluation, which ironically got shut down because it wasn't delivering in a timely manner. And then machine learning until data, but it's mostly machine learning, big data and machine learning, not the same thing I know, but particularly machine learning emerged as a 4th cross-cutting theme. So we do have quite a lot of work around both big data and machine learning separately and in the studies. So in the end, CEDIL over the 6 years, it was going nearly 6 years, had these 3 programs of work I mentioned. We funded 20 projects from the externally funded projects from the Commission for the Programs of Work, but we also had these internal products. Actually, it's 15 inception papers, it's just gone up. We had 5 pre-inception papers in the end, 15 pre-inception papers, and we produced 4 sets of guidelines. All that was done by consortium members as part of the front end of CEDIL. And in addition to funding the research projects that we'll produce in the end, journal papers, because that's what academics like to do, we do publish a lot of stuff on the CEDIL website. Go to the CEDIL website, there's an awful lot of stuff there. So methods working papers, synthesis working papers, briefs, and various research project papers from the finished projects. They're still coming along because of the delays, COVID and so on. We're really pushing up against the end of CEDIL to get most products out, but we're committed to doing that. And there was quite a good country spread. So the 20 projects covered 22 countries, because some were multi-country, and you do see there the usual suspects: Ethiopia, Uganda, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ghana to an extent, Kenya, South Africa. They're very much usual suspects, but you have also here Syria, Lebanon, Chad, Niger, and these are not usual suspects. And so we did manage to be funding studies in countries which hitherto had far fewer impact evaluations. So this idea of filling the geographic gaps was partially achieved because, yep, we did stuff in usual suspect countries, but we also did stuff in countries where there really hadn't been a lot of work done previously. Apologies for the dog in the background if you can hear it. So here's an example of some of the products that we came from CEDIL. So these were actually examples from the fast track studies, which was an additional stage that got inserted into the CEDIL rocket structure. Once we'd done the inception papers, there was a feeling that the ideas in there were quite academic. Well, there were a couple of reasons for doing the fast track studies. So one was that they were fairly academically oriented. And so we wanted to do a bit more work to bring them to a stage where the application by practitioners would be more obvious. And so we commissioned additional papers to take the ideas a bit further forward. And the example that worked best, I think, is probably the mid-level theory, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But the second reason was because I used to run 3IE some time ago, and I'm used to this. You have a grant program, and the funder gives you a grant program, knowing full well the grants will take 3 years to deliver anything. Then after 6 months, they start saying, "Well, you've got nothing to show for yourself. What are you doing?" So the fast track studies were also put in place so that there would not be this gap between the inception papers and the funded studies, which have been at least 18 months and probably 2 years before anything came from them. And so there'd be a 2-year gap of CEDIL doing nothing from the point of view of the funder, because it wasn't producing outputs. That was to be expected. But I know from experience, funders don't like that because they think you're doing nothing. So the fast track studies were put in place, like, let's do this as a way so that we could be seen to be doing something. Of course, researchers don't necessarily deliver on time. I'm one of them. So the fast track studies haven't always been as fast as they might have been, but they did give an additional set of quite low cost studies to CEDIL. An example of this and the structured approach that we took with CEDIL is the 3IE map of map and its children. So the map of maps was a pre-inception paper. So it was there in the proposal that we wrote to do a map of maps. And so it is what it says on the tin. It's a map of existing evidence and gap maps. And at that time, there were 78. We haven't updated this. It needs updating because the number must have easily doubled by now. We're involved in 20 odd maps ourselves. And so not some of which came from CEDIL, mostly not, of course. So the map of maps was done, and the map of maps was used to identify areas of policy interest to DFID, as it then was, where there weren't existing maps and maps would be useful. And from that, we identified 3 areas: disability, access to justice, and transport, where we would do evidence and gap maps. And those maps were done as inception papers. So they were going in the next phase of CEDIL. The evidence and gap maps, I have a paper in a CEDIL working paper on the strategic use of evidence and gap maps. And if you read that paper, you'll see that I believe very strongly EGMs are not an end in themselves, they're a means to an end. And they're a good basis for identifying areas where reviews can be done. And so working with the International Centre for Evidence and Disability at London School of Hygiene, we, meaning Campbell, we did a series of what were initial rapid reviews, and then with PENDA funding, which is another FCDO project on inclusive disability development, we had done a set of reviews using the studies identified in the map, and we did with PENDA funding update the map to inform the reviews. Disability was picked as a priority by DFID because there was a big disability summit in 2018, and they wanted this map out there in time for the summit, and it was delivered in time for the summit. So there was, there was a demand, very strong demand for that product. Transport, access to justice, yeah, less so. Access to justice is coming now, some demand and interest. Transport, I actually sent it this week to ADBs. A couple of times I've sent it to them. They have interest in that area. And so there's other people interested in this, but let's focus here on disability. And so one thing I believe very strongly is evidence-based decision-making products, which are products that allow decision makers to make decisions based on evidence without having to go back and read the evidence. And evidence portals are an example of that. So under the Fast Track program, we funded International Centre for Evidence and Disability to do an evidence portal on using the reviews that we were doing using the studies in the map. And the version done under the Fast Track study was a pilot version under our use of evidence program of work, and they've since got money, I forget the foundation, to scale it up with I think Wellspring, to scale it up to have many more studies. So here you see this sequent approach of 4 different stages of research, from a map of maps through to a decision maker facing product using the evidence that was drawn out of that mapping process, and CEDIL's allowed that to happen because of the way in which it was structured. So some brief reflections on CEDIL's research program, and what I've stressed mainly here is the sequenced approach worked. So having this idea of pre-inception, inception, programs of work, then summarising at the end. That's worked. That was really nice, and you should do more of that. Basically, you do need to keep the eye on the ball. You do need a strong research directorate to really make sure that happens. But if you do have that, then it works, and one that's going to believe in that vision and not. And I know, I mean, I don't want to say too much about it, but the reason why I think it didn't get let before the contract is it was too much about doing things academics wanted to do rather than seeing a vision for CEDIL, what CEDIL could deliver. the investment in methods worked. It made sense to invest in methods and say, we're about the methods here. So, of course, I believe very strong mantra, you should be issues-led, not methods-led. And so mostly want to do evaluations to consider about what's the relevant evaluation question, what are the best methods to answer them. But here we wanted to focus on methods to try and identify methods that could answer the questions not already being asked. We largely didn't fill sector geographic gaps, and I've caveated that. We did get to some countries where there aren't many studies already, but sector gaps, we said everything but health, but actually we funded quite a lot of health, and we didn't get a lot of stuff coming in areas where there aren't many studies. We did get a small cluster of humanitarian interventions, but it is quite a small cluster, and that's a growing area of research anyway, so it wasn't really such a gap. The original idea of CEDIL was that we were going to identify and prescribe methods to be used. We abandoned that idea in favour of broader programmes of work that would allow the researchers to develop the ideas within those broad themes, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. We didn't have so much use of evidence. The third programme of work, there was some work there. Epicenter did a couple of good pieces of work there. We had the Disability Evidence Portal. There was also an evidence portal for Education Endowment Foundation transferred to West Africa with eBase. That was good stuff, but mainly most of the money was in the first two programmes of work, complex interventions and transferability. And the last point I'd make, which I think is very important, and it's about how CEDIL functioned, I think, and you wanted to do something, you want to be a scout, not a settler, who would need a different model to implementing the programme. So that's why the mountains are here. So there's an analogy I use, which is you have scouts that go out and explore new territory. They cross the mountains and see what's on the other side. Whereas there's settlers who go to the areas that have been explored, okay, it's safe here, and they come and settle on the frontiers. And what we funded in CEDIL were frontier settlers, not scouts. And I think for scouts, we would have needed a different type of smaller targeted programme, not a general call for proposals with broad programmes of work. And so we could have done scouts, but we did a different model to one that had been requested in the RFP, and a different way of approaching what we were going to commission. And frontier settlers are good. I mean, frontiers need to be settled, and all the stuff around machine learning, mid-level theory, different approaches to evaluating complexity, that was all frontier stuff. So I'm not saying that was a bad thing, just pointing out it's a different thing to funding scouts. So we've got 3 areas we're going to discuss. I'm going to mention mid-level theory briefly, and then I'm going to talk about evaluating complexity and machine learning. And then actually, then Radical will go on to use of evidence. So I missed that on the slide. So mid-level theory, I'm going to do this very briefly. There is a lesson learning paper on this coming out. It came from this phased approach. So the original papers from London School of Hygiene under the pre-inception papers mentioned mid-level theory. And then one of their inception papers really went into more detail about that. And then we commissioned a fast-track study from Nancy Cartwright and colleagues to actually lay out the approach in more detail, which is not that one there. That's the Epicenter methods paper from the inception paper. There is a methods brief and methods paper on mid-level theory. And then mid-level theory was applied in several of the funded studies because it was the second programme work was enhancing transferability through use of mid-level theory. And so that structured approach applied very clearly in the case of mid-level theory. What is it? I'm still struggling with this, but basically it's somewhere that sits between a very general theory that's too general to be empirically testable and a very specific project level theory applied in a particular context. And that gives a very broad range. And Nancy in her paper does say mid-level theory can sit anywhere in that range. And that's one issue I'm struggling with at the moment in the paper, lesson learning paper, is, well, can we narrow that down a bit, make it a bit more specific and useful? The key thing is about trying to understand underlying causal processes. And I think, I mean, to explain the difference between mid-level theory and a good theory of change is actually quite difficult. So, but that's because I think a lot of theories of change as they're written are actually written as mid-level theories. But realizing that they're such can help us actually explore them in a bit more detail. So there were different approaches to developing MLT in the funded studies. Some were very bottom-up. So basically they allowed the data to help them identify what the theory was. They engaged with evidence, either quantitative or qualitative, to come up with, well, here's my theory based on what I've seen in the data. Machine learning really opens you up to that. You can't be entirely theory 3 at the start, point you have to decide which variables to select, but there's basically more data driven. Or there's top down, where you say, here's my model, here's my data. So the study will involve men, boys in family planning, took an existing conceptual framework as their mid-level theories. That's a top-down approach, or an initiative approach. Well, actually, I didn't put one down, but there's a few which are more in the middle, where they have some sort of idea of theory, but they develop the theory more iterating between theory and data. And in reality, most approaches would be a bit more in the middle than rather at either extreme. Just to give an example, I know I'm going way beyond time. Here's an example of a common causal chain, quite a simplified causal chain. And the point about mid-level theory is every arrow here is a different causal process. And each causal process has a different set of what Nancy and her colleagues call support factors. So things that are facilitators of the process, derailers, which are barriers to the process, and safeguards, which are project design features that can try and prevent the derailers derailing the causal process from taking effect. What's your problem? So what paying attention to mid-level theory has helped me do is think more about the causal process and the assumption underlying it. So it's common that you have you would have a theory change diagram, say, train people, they then do this. And that's not automatic at all. And one of the assumptions there is, well, is training them, actually, how's that going to bring about the change? How does training change people's behavior? And the most common assumption is the one contained in this causal chain diagram, which is providing training increases knowledge. So common assumption is providing information fills a lack of knowledge. But that may not be the case. There are many cases where people do know what they're meant to do. So driver education, which is where you've been caught speeding or drink driving, have to go to a driver education program. It's not that you don't know you're not meant to speed or you shouldn't drink drive. You just do it anyway. And so it might be an exaltation component to that, or a shaming component. I didn't put it down, or a deterrent component. This is such a horrible thing, I don't want to have to do this again, so I'm going to obey the rules. Or it could be because you're exposed to the consequences of shaming. So research in road safety shows that people underestimate the risk, so they don't apply to them. I'm okay, I can drive after a couple of drinks. Some people maybe can't, but I can. And so they don't think the risks apply to them. And so trying to get them to understand they really do apply to you and what the consequences might be of that. Or it could provide support. I put consultants there because classic case of agency is employer consultant. We want to make this change. We know we want to make the change. Having a external consultant say it, then that can give it support to making the change. And so you can imagine cases where, so if a woman wants to use contraceptives and the husband's resistant, then providing information might help her support that argument in the household. But it might be you're looking at the wrong constraints. It might just be people want to use contraceptives, they know about contraceptives, but they don't have any access, or it's the partner that's obstructing them from doing so. And so you need to understand through formative research what the constraint you're actually facing is. Nearly finished. So one of the assumptions here when you're saying, okay, adopt this behavior, is that your behavior is not already being adopted. So an impact evaluation of agricultural extension services in Kenya by the World Bank, quite a long time ago now, 25 years ago or more, it's found that the practices being promoted by the extension services were not being adopted by the farmers because they already were adopting them. So the extension services were telling farmers to do things they were already doing. And so clearly that makes no difference to their behavior. And so here's transferability in action. Is you say, here's my, at the project level, far left, here's my finding. This farmer's already used the techniques being promoted by extension workers. You take that to a mid-level principle, promote behaviours not already present in the target population, and you can take that back down to a new setting, which is contraception. So you target messaging on modern contraceptives to population groups with low contraceptive prevalence. And it's like it's obvious, but if you're an evaluator, you find so many things that go wrong in studies, in interventions that were obvious in hindsight, but weren't anticipated at the beginning. I'm actually going to skip that because I've gone on too long already. So over to you, Eduardo.
Okay. So Eduardo, Howard have taken most of your time. So if you can, if you can hurry up, and then we can have the other two people to join. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I will continue Howard's presentation of the lessons learned from our programs of work, and I'm trying to move my slide. Oh, okay, here you go. So the first programs of work of CEDIL was evaluating complex intervention, as Howard has mentioned, and I think this was really number one, and is one area of work where the funder FCDO really felt strongly about. So you can probably say that one of the reasons for establishing CEDIL was evaluating complex intervention. So complex intervention are a development project with many components, many outcomes, many stakeholders, and so on. And they're notoriously difficult to evaluate because it's difficult to establish a control group. They have multiple outcomes and nonlinear effects, and so on. And normally what people do is to evaluate these programs using either a sort of a randomized control trial with many arms for accounting for different components, or doing a qualitative study using mixed methods, right? And none of these two approaches was felt to be satisfactory, right? So it was not really answering questions about the effectiveness of the intervention. So we looked at CEDIL at different I'm still trying to move my slides. Programs, approaches to evaluate complex intervention. We did a review, and we did find identified a quite wide range of methods. This list, the methods included here are not all methods that are available, but some of the methods that could be used in evaluating complex intervention, that includes agent-based modeling, system dynamics for system-level interventions, or QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, synthetic control methods for portfolio interventions, and also methods more in experimental tradition, like factorial trials, adaptive trials, and structural modeling. Now, some of these methods were used by studies that we funded, so I could mention some examples and of studies using, for example, one was presented yesterday, of using a randomized control trial that was built to be adaptive to a very uncertain environment, and thus changing as the environment changes. And we have the use of a set of quasi-experimental methods and machine learning in the evaluation of seeds for recovery. That was also discussed in previous talks. I will talk about machine learning again in a minute. And so one of the first observations that I would make in terms of lessons learned is that, yes, we did support evaluation of complex interventions. However, few of interventions, if any, were actually scouting in the way that Howard was defining a few minutes ago. So there wasn't really studies making use of completely new methods, or methods that have never been used before, such as, for example, the one that I mentioned, like that we didn't find any study using agent-based modeling, for example. And what are the reasons for this? Well, I think scouting, as was saying Howard, crossing the mountains and trying to find or using new methods, there is a strong element of risk in doing that. For researchers and who are not familiar with the methods, and also in terms of incentives. So there is a risk of not being able to publish studies in this area. So there is some reluctance and difficulty for researchers to do work in areas that are completely new. And certainly we probably need a different approach, and in order to support researchers to conduct these studies in these completely new areas. Another reflection about complexity, evaluating complex intervention I'd like to make is that, but nevertheless, we did find very interesting studies using different methods. And so my reflection is that maybe sometimes, or perhaps we are sometimes exaggerating complexity in the sense that, of course, we can try to explore new methods and trying to use new methodologies. But it's also true that a lot can be done using existing methods and combining existing methods. So some of the evaluation that we have funded evaluating complex intervention are using a mix of methodologies between qualitative and quantitative, and they do quite a good job in making sense of complex interventions. The second programs of work I'm going to talk about is machine learning. Machine learning was actually not a programs of work. It is not something that had been identified as a priority by the funder, by FCDO, or by the intellectual leadership team of CEDIL. So it's something that emerged from the research team. So when people started making proposal for grant applications to CEDIL, they identified the use of machine learning methods as the main innovation of their study. And so this is certainly the case that machine learning is seen by researchers, at least today, as one key fundamental innovation in impact evaluation. Now, one things that are important to understand about machine learning methods as applied in evaluation is that machine learning algorithms are not causal models, and so they do not explain phenomena. They make predictions, right? So what is the potential role in evaluation? Again, we did a review within CEDIL of the use of machine learning methods in evaluation, and we identified 5 main uses. And the first is to support the use of existing methods. For example, we have many researchers that are doing, say, a randomized controlled trial, but then use a new machine learning technique to analyze the results. They're used for prediction. So people are using machine learning methods for predicting food security, emergencies, or even conflict. They can be used for targeting interventions, for selecting, for example, the right set of beneficiaries of an intervention, or they can be used for collecting new data. Right? So there is a lot of work in trying to extract data from, for example, images, and even from text, for example. And finally, there is a final use of machine learning methods is in assessing the impact of interventions, not for the population in general, not only for the population in general, but for subgroups of the population, right? So to go beyond the average population effect and trying to be able to see what is the impact for different sectors of the population or the heterogeneity of impact. And this is the area where we focused our work. In fact, all studies funded by CEDIL that use machine learning methods precisely with the goal of assessing the impact of intervention across groups, right? So there was one presentation yesterday, is the evaluation of seeds programs and agricultural intervention in a conflict area, showing that the intervention had a larger impact for female-headed households and in areas that were less affected by conflict. And a similar approach was used in evaluation of a cash transfer program and of a skill formation program in Uganda, again, supported by CEDIL. Okay, so what are the main lessons that I can draw from the use of machine learning as used in CEDIL funded program? Well, first, as I mentioned, is the things that we learned definitely is that machine learning is not going to be a substitute for causal inference. So it not it will not be, the use of machine learning will not replace standard designs, experimentals of the kind for evaluating program, will be supportive. So people will use machine learning methods in order to improve the analysis or sometimes the design of the intervention, but the causal inference framework will not change because of machine learning methods. A second lessons learned, I think I would say that the two areas that at least we believe that are more promising in the use of machine learning methods in evaluation will be precisely the analysis of heterogeneity of impact in comparison to others, and also one that we didn't explore much and through our program, but is also very promising in the future, which is innovation in the collection of data. Now, in terms of what is the role of CEDIL or an organization similar to CEDIL in supporting and promoting machine learning methods, I think this is the field is very different from the case of complexity, right? So here there is no reluctance or by researchers. Actually, there's a very strong interest by researching in using these methods. There is also a strong interest by funders in promoting the use of these methods, and publication incentives are very strong. So it's very easy to publish a paper using machine learning methods. So there is no, I don't think there is a strong need for organization promoting the use in this method. So what I see as the potential for CEDIL organization like CEDIL to do in this area is to try to direct or orient the research in an area that is maybe useful to policy or that is more ethically responsible. And so that's where I would see the role of CEDIL in promoting machine learning. I think I'm going to conclude here so that I can give more space to other presenters. So over to you, Radhika.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And you know, this method studies is very, very important, you know, on what we have done. So Radhika is going to take us on, you know, the communication and using the evidence to engage policymakers and practitioners. So Radhika, over to you.
I'm here to share some thoughts on what we've learned from research uptake for CEDIL. It has been integrated in the program. It is one of the research priorities, as Howard mentioned. It was one of the programs of work, increasing evidence use. And so particularly there was that responsibility as a program to walk the talk. And it was really embedded in the design of the program from the get-go. So, Saul, can you change the slide? Thank you. So, right from the commissioning stage, you know, this was front and center. So it was part of the review criteria, assessing the potential for policy and practical relevance, whether there was a track record with the research team in having that strong partnership with implementers, decision makers, working with key stakeholders. And in the proposal form, applicants were expected to elaborate on the pathways to research impact, which gave reviewers a sense of whether they care about impact and what they would do to maximize the usefulness of the project. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's it. And so at the inception phase, we developed guidelines on stakeholder engagement and evidence use, and developed a plan template for research teams. And this was a deliverable in the inception phase of the program. And it was really heartening to see that all of the project teams worked on very comprehensive plans. And these plans covered lots of dimensions. So there was context analysis, looking at, you know, the various factors that could affect evidence use, including political economy factors, thinking about specific objectives for evidence use for each of the projects, mapping stakeholders, individuals, organizations who could positively or negatively influence evidence use objectives, thinking about risks to evidence use, and then figuring out what are some of the tailored ways you can be looking at engagement and communication with stakeholders, thinking about their needs, interests, priorities. We also encourage teams to think about indicators to track impact. So going beyond just looking at citations or download numbers, thinking about impact in terms of how is the evidence actually being used to inform decision making, in terms of informing program design, informing scale up, informing budget decisions, informing the commissioning of new evaluations, for instance. Teams were encouraged to think about learning on all aspects, designing evaluations, implementing them, promoting evidence use. Next slide, please. So, and what did research teams do? I mean, it was great to see that lots of teams dedicated a reasonable proportion of the budget to stakeholder engagement and evidence use. We'd said that we'd encourage teams to dedicate up to 15%. Some did, some a little less than that. But most projects we could see really engaged with stakeholders in both formal and informal ways. If you've attended sessions in the last few days, you'd have seen that lots of teams had it embedded in the research design. So multiple workshops, for instance, to co-design research projects, validate findings. The desk-based systematic reviews had advisory groups with very diverse kind of stakeholder membership. And we had a range of communication activities and products. So beyond just the journal articles and the working papers, there were toolkits developed, there was a portal developed, there were briefs, blogs, videos, newspaper articles, lots of presentations made, webinars, and very effective social media outreach. And it was great to see that some even developed theories of change on research impact and actively monitored and measured evidence use, which has helped us document some of those stories of change. Next slide, please. I think it's a bit slow. Yeah. As a program, we had our own outreach strategy, of course, to support the teams. We were there to support the teams, but our focus was on sharing learning, on ensuring that all of these numerous outputs were accessible, useful. We had the big picture, so it was useful to bring different teams together. And I think our role was a big role that we played was in convening conversations, bringing research together with implementers, policymakers, and having lots of conversations. So as you can see, lots of seminars, lots of webinars. We had our annual conference and lots of products available on the website, which, as I can see, there was a question asked. All of the outputs will be migrated to policycommons.net. We'll have a page on the OPM website, so it'll still be very much accessible beyond the lifetime of CEDIL. And of course, we are on social media, so we've just been using our role to sort of disseminate what the project teams have been doing. And next slide, please. And as you can see, all of this work is starting to deliver impact. And it's great that we're able to document some of these stories of change. Research uptake, as you know, is a long-term game, but we're already beginning to see some of these changes. So, I mean, it's how CEDIL defines it is where evidence has been used to inform different kinds of changes. It could be policy program design, methods, decisions on methods. So just presenting 3 stories that we have. So the first one is where the findings from a meta-analysis that looked at the transferability of global education evidence to specific contexts in Cameroon, Chad, Nigeria, and Niger. This was used to inform the design of a pilot project on performance-based financing with teachers, where the aim was to improve education quality and retention of children. And it also informed the design of another pilot evaluation of a menstrual hygiene management project in Cameroon. Now, the meta-analysis showed that the evidence was quite limited in these areas, and it was best to sort of look at pilots to consider design features and look at efficacy, acceptability of interventions before looking at implementing a big program. And I think what a big achievement of this team was to develop this toolkit that helps visualize the evidence and look at dimensions that policymakers need to look at, which is the cost of the evidence, the impact of the evidence, the strength of the evidence. So do check out this toolkit, which is already being used a lot. Next slide, please. The second story of change is based on an evidence synthesis. It's findings of this evidence synthesis on teaching at the right level has been used to inform program design and scale up. of TARL, Teaching at the Right Level program in Botswana. This was a study led by Noah Mangrist and Rachel Meager. And the study found that, small changes in delivery have, an impact on the effectiveness of the program. And monitoring data is crucial in tracking implementation. So, and it also found that volunteers were more effective in delivering the program than teachers. And so some of these design features have been incorporated in Botswana. The findings have also informed conversations on national programs in Namibia and South Africa. Next slide, please. And finally, the Seeds for Recovery project in Syria. So the study team made certain recommendations to the FAO, which have been incorporated in the FCDO funded Building Local Resilience program. Specific recommendations that they made were on clustering interventions to build resilience and stronger impact. They also recommended looking at local markets. Some of these recommendations have been incorporated in the design of the program. Next slide, please. So if we were to reflect on some of the stories of change, it's clear that, this sort of strong stakeholder engagement and communication through the life cycle of the project has paid off. If you look at any of these teams, there's obviously significant capacity in working with stakeholders, but also a strong record of partnership, of this sort of co-creation with decision makers. And I think it's something to be said about how these proposals were selected. A lot of the teams are committed to working with decision makers. And finally, we'd like to take some credit also in that we were also there to sort of support, offering guidelines and advise and support on stakeholder engagement and evidence use. Next slide, please. And then, just finally, some overarching lessons. I think the experience with CEDIL shows that we really need a clear strategic approach on research uptake. That has to begin from, it has to be right at the start of the program. And it's important for funders to sort of signal the importance of research uptake and impact. And I think CEDIL did that. It signaled at every stage, whether it's the review criteria for proposals, it's in the offering of guidelines, it's in the sort of quality assurance support provided. It's in the expectation of not just papers, but also deliverables, briefs that are accessible to decision makers. And finally, I think a program like CEDIL plays a very important role in convening conversations, because you have the big picture, you're bringing different people together, you have a portfolio of work, you are supporting peer learning, and there's a big role that we play in contributing to advances in the field. That's it from me. Handing over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Dika. I think that is a very good thing that we have learned, the importance of communication and stakeholder engagement. We will go to Sean from FCDO perspective and reflections on the work of CEDIL, since she has been involved from the beginning. We will really love to hear from you on your reflections. Thank you, Sean.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And just a huge thank you to all the speakers that have come before me, because they've given such a kind of rich tapestry here of where and how, CEDIL has had an impact. So, I've got a few reflections here, but I'm not going to talk for too long because I really want to kind of circle back to Q&A and so on. But look, what CEDIL did and the work that it's produced and the engagements that it's had are absolutely right and hugely relevant to the work that's happening across the development sector. For me, sitting in FCDO, there's some specific things that are that I want to draw out from the work that CEDIL's done. So firstly, that sort of transferring of knowledge, right? The work that CEDIL has done to teach people at the right level and across a range of contexts to inform the policy and programming thinking. It's easy when you're sitting outside of government to not recognise how important that is, but that sort of teaching, learning, building capability is absolutely essential, and that's the kind of one of the critical elements of the CEDIL programme, you know, from my perspective. You know, the second thing I want to draw out is complexity, right? You know, CEDIL was focused around, you know, looking at evaluations in really complex interventions, right? This isn't going to change, right? We know that across development work. And actually the work that CEDIL has done to look at kind of more non-traditional methods has been absolutely important, and there's going to be far more need for innovation, right? The journey, we're still on the journey, aren't we? And then the last kind of key reflection I wanted to draw out was around the role that CEDIL has played to really support evidence use in the organisation, but recognising that, again, that is a long-term process, right? Sitting where I am in FCDO as the newly appointed chief statistician, I can really see that, you know, particularly if I think about FCDO, we're making more progress now on terms of evidence and data and use of analysis, but we're still forming as an organisation. And, you know, the reality is that whole how government works is a very, very long-term piece. And particularly for me, you know, there's using evidence, and then there's that using evidence in a really mature way, where you're making sure that it's sort of timely, relevant and robust. And, you know, there's still lots and lots of work to do. But the work that CEDIL has done with FCDO on this has been, you know, hugely, hugely valued and impactful. I wanted to draw out a couple of pieces of work that I'm aware of from my own sort of work around evidence and science and more recently data, where I know that there's been, you know, a particular, you know, real, particularly valuable and impactful to our work. So there's work that you heard about earlier in the week on yesterday around Seeds for Recovery evaluation. Now, this was particularly important you know, in terms of internal discussions on this theme, and it's contributed, you know, in a massive way to kind of step up our evidence base in the organisation on a really difficult context and an undervaluated theme, which was, you know, partly where that drive for CEDIL came from in the first place. You know, let's not evaluate the stuff that's easy. Let's really work hard to evaluate the stuff that's hard. But for me, and I think, you know, if you had anyone here from FCDO leadership today, you know, it would be odd to not be reflecting about how difficult the past few years have been. You know, we have grappled with the pandemic. You know, ODA budget uncertainties have been not small. And, you know, I can't praise teams enough within FCDO for their handling of this, but I know that will have been tough for those working on our programmes. Alongside this, we've had political instability domestically and around the globe. And what I kind of want to draw out with that, I don't want to use all that uncertainty and challenge as an excuse. What I really want people to reflect on today is that CEDIL has achieved a lot despite all of that. And it has definitely proven that this type of work and this kind of model of working and programming can really deliver. Now, you know, as we draw to the close of any of these kinds of programs working across evidence or evaluation, one of the things that I always talk about is how do we ensure that that we don't lose that huge asset, right? You know, I feel that one of the things that, you know, particularly as we've gone through the machinery of government changes, is that, you know, knowledge management is tough. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we're able to maximise the use of all the great outputs from CEDIL. So, you know, as I look forward, I do want to draw out some kind of messages of hope for the future. And in particular, you know, what are the kind of the big next steps in FCDO? So as some of you will be aware, FCDO published its first evaluation strategy in 2022, which set out for the first time the ambition for evaluation across the FCDO. Now, you know, these kinds of strategies are big steps and small steps, but particularly for the team, getting that strategy out quite early in the forming of FCDO was absolutely critical. You know, I'm now involved in FCDO's first data strategy, but the fact that the evaluation strategy became before the data strategy kind of speaks volumes, actually. Alongside this, there's increasing support for thematic and portfolio evaluations across FCDO, and a real interest in how we strengthen our approach to measuring the impact of influencing. You know, I think people listening today will understand why that's so important, but I just think this is an absolutely fascinating area. It's also essential, and this is something that's being driven cross-government, that we're investing more in really robust synthesis to understand the cost effectiveness and be able to drive that sort of good value for money investments across everything we do in the civil service and government. And then finally, and you know, this is where CEDIL has hugely helped us on our journey. You know, FCDO will be continuing to look at ways to build evidence in hard to measure areas. But my final comment today is just a huge thank you to the CEDIL team and everything they have done to support FCDO. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Sean. David?
Thank you very much. That is great. I'm sitting down here writing the next steps of FCDO, and I think I will bring it in the summary. I've been able to jot down about 5 next steps, and I think the importance of CEDIL. I think now, Sean, so we will come to you, and then we will do the audience poll before we take questions and answers. So, Saul, over to you.
Hopefully you'll be able to see that on your screen now. The question is impact evaluation just a fad? Is it just a fad? And if you hover over the questions, you'll see the full responses of the 3 you can choose.
So it's for all audience members. It turns out I'm not allowed to vote. The hosts and panelists cannot vote, but all of you in the audience, you can vote. So please click one of these. We're doing this right now. It's a live poll. So please get clicking. We've got 3 questions, I think it is, coming up. So I want to see the answer to this one first.
Lots of votes coming in. Thank you.
Okay.
Please vote. Please vote. Please vote.
There is no right or wrong answer.
Okay, we have about 70% of people having voted and it's stopped, so I'll just share these results.
Oh, it's pretty close. Oh no, not that close. I can't read. Okay, it's here to stay is a clear majority, with but a third thinking the focus will shift back to it's here to stay, but the focus is going to shift to a fuller range of evaluation questions, which I must admit is where I would have come out, not to say that's the right answer. But that's consistent with being here to stay. It's just that there's an increased focus around, there has been for some time, using theory-based approaches, obviously, which can allow to answer a full range of questions across the causal chain. But also there are questions around the traditional evaluation criteria around relevance, for example, not addressed in impact evaluations. Bob Picciotto, the founder of OED at the World Bank, used to say impact evaluations are not evaluations, because it didn't address those sort of questions. But there's no reason why they can't be embedded in the evaluation that does do that. I think we'll, in the donor space, we'll start to see more of that. In academics, you have this problem, that's just not something that's publishable. And so they'll be doing more frontier and scouting stuff, but as Eduardo explained, scouting is only risky, so they're mainly frontier settlers. Okay, thanks, Saul. Shall we put up the next one?
Yeah, thank you. So the second question here, has the rise of randomized control trials, RCTs, been good for the evaluation field? Please vote now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's a clearer census, actually steered by my answer on the previous question. So I'm a 2.5, maybe. So I don't agree. I wouldn't agree with the first one that no, it took time, resource away. There wasn't an emphasis on valid designs to know what worked and what didn't, and process evaluations were lulling people into a false sense of security. 80% of interventions were successful, and that's simply the opposite of what is actually the case. So I think it was a very useful reminder. It's like the punk rock of the evaluation system. You need to come in and shake things up. And I think that was needed. And I'm showing my age there, but yes, can research 1970s music history. So I'm agreeing with 2, but I would more agree with 3, because I think it shouldn't be RCTs and nothing else. You get extreme randomistas who think, well, that's the only form of evaluation you need. And it's not, because a whole set of relevant evaluation questions about interventions are not answered by RCTs, even when you can do an RCT. And then there's a whole set of interventions for which you can't do RCTs, but you want to know about effectiveness. And that's what CEDIL was designed to try and address. And particularly Eduardo's presentation around complexity is precisely that. What can we do in those cases where we can't use RCTs? And CEDIL's help make progress in those areas. But there's certainly more work to be done. Thanks, Saul. We have another question?
Yeah, so our third poll, is the future of impact evaluation? And choose one of the responses before, and please select all of the options that you agree with, so you can click on multiple options on the screen there.
Is this our last question?
We've got one more, Howard.
One more after this. Oh yeah, we had one. Okay, good, yeah.
Okay.
I'm keen to see. Okay, interesting. Because yes, if I had to rank them, I would be torn between 2 and 4, whether to rank those, which one of those to put at the top. And I would clearly said is about 2, the identifying different approach to causal claims, and that's come out right on top. And I think that's where the current focus is in impact evaluation, not necessarily for quality people, traditionals or RCT type people, but evaluation community as a whole. But my big thing, and it's not just because I'm at Campbell, the causation went the other way. I went to Campbell because I really believe is that we need to summarize body of evidence in systematic reviews and then translate it into evidence-based decision-making products. And that is I think the future of knowledge translation, knowledge brokering. And the other things also come up as important, though, the training and the other rigorous methods. So I think that's well, I don't really agree with 3. So 3 got nearly 46% of the vote, nearly half. I don't think you require rigorous evaluation of all interventions, it's going to be too costly. So everything needs to be part of an ME system. Whether we evaluate everything in detail depends on resources and what students do. I'd be more strategic about selection evaluations and particularly impact evaluations. Okay, last question, please, Saul.
Thank you, Howard. Our final question: how useful are impact evaluations for informing policy? And please take all the answers that you think apply.
Not all of them, because they contradict each other. Ones that you think apply.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very few people agree with the first statement. I think that's been, most might be putting it a bit strongly, but many have been with my view on that. And I less agree with 2 because I don't think, I mean, rigor is not something that's correlated with the usefulness particularly. I certainly agree with the third and fourth statements. I'm happy to see that's where the majority agree as well. Of course, we had quite a self-selecting sample here. I don't think it's a representative sample of the population or even the evaluation community as a whole. It's very interesting to see these results and the emphasis put on stakeholder engagement and evidence use and positive evidence there. So thank you, everyone. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting poll. It's something that I think you all have participated, and is going to really contribute to what CEDIL have been doing. We have only 40 minutes left, and I would like all the panelists to, if possible, switch on your video so that the audience can see you. Some have done well, so all those who are on, you can download the papers that Howard was referring to, on the link that we have on board, and also the mid-level papers also have been, the link has been shared so you can download. We have only one question on the board, as I can see now, except maybe something is somewhere that I haven't seen, but we have only one question here from Patrick Ward. It will be interesting to hear more from Eduardo on the use of existing method to evaluate different types of compressed program and contests. And does he think there are identifiable gaps that are remaining in the toolkit of approaches available? Please let your questions come. I have seen another one, but Eduardo can take this one, and then if there's no questions, I will let the panelists give us a summary, of what they have presented. Okay, so Eduardo, you are on board.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to answer Patrick's question. So there are actually 2 questions. First, if there are gaps, there are for sure, particularly in the review that we did that we made of methods for complex interventions. I would say that so we focus our work particularly on methods that have a sort of strong causal inference approach, and therefore we left out qualitative methods. And so people will say, well, why, for example, process tracing should be included? Certainly should. I mean, there are other, so there are at least a couple of areas that needs to be explored more. One is the qualitative approaches to analyzing complex interventions. And I think another one that we didn't cover And certainly is another area that might be developed in the future is the use of new statistical methods. So it's machine learning again, basically. So surely there will be applications of machine learning in evaluation of complex intervention. I think that the question was, well, actually two questions. Oh yes, the other part is also very interesting. In fact, yes, we did, when we approached the review, we tried to not just to list or describe methods, but also trying to match methods to particular programs, right? So it was quick on through the slides, but precisely the idea was to say, for example, we identify different types of complex interventions, and like portfolio, system level. So there are interventions that are at levels of the system, and where clearly you can take the approach of unpacking them completely, but then you're no longer answering the question that refers to the system. So if you want to answer a question at the system level, you need system approaches, like, for example, system dynamics or agent-based modeling. The methods are not new. They've been there here for decades, but they're just not being used. And they're not being used in general. There are hundreds of papers on using these methods, but they're not being used in evaluation, right? And so similar we did for the other studies. So we did actually try to match program types to evaluation tools.
Good. Thank you. There were some questions that have been answered, so I will not repeat them. There were about 3 questions. What will happen to the CEDIL website? It had been answered. And other questions that came on the evaluation use program presentation. Could you please list or post the list of indicators of impact you monitor and by instrument you use to do this across studies or guide to do that? It has been answered, so you can also look at it. And someone wanted us to share, the link again, which we have done. So let me go back to the panelists, and they can give a summary. Howard, you talk about the evolution, how far we have come. Eduardo, you talk about the methods. Rodika, you talk about the stakeholder engagement and communication. Are there any, and then Sean, you gave us, FCDO next steps. Can you guys summarize in 1 minute or 2 minutes, what we have learned from CEDIL, work over the years?
Okay, thank you, David. So 2 things are that I don't answer the question. I speak for longer than you asked me to, but I'll try to only do one of those 2 things. So I just talked about the question of what next for CEDIL, and the answer is nothing. We're going into the great beyond. So CEDIL closes in basically end of March, mid-April. So and there will not be a CEDIL 2. And so we are concerned about the CEDIL legacy, and the website, some of the material on the website will be available elsewhere once CEDIL closes. The bigger challenge then is what needs to be done to still continue to support methods innovation to fill the gaps we spoke about, both in evaluation and evidence synthesis. And that's a question for all of you. And the other is how to ensure that actually staff in FCDO are kept informed of those innovations and are using them. And I have ideas around those, but you can also plug them into the chat or the Q&A right now, or email them into us, because that's quite important. One thing I will do a plug there is we're a consortium, and various of the members, including particularly Campbell, do have regular webinars. So there's a Campbell webinar coming up by Campbell South Asia on a new map we've done, evidence resources for pandemics. And it's the first, and what we've done in that map is to define different types of evidence resource and develop critical appraisal tools for different evidence resources. It's all quite innovative, and put them into an evidence map. So we're mapping evidence resources. So that's an example. But there's a Campbell webinar every month, and you can stay abreast of developments in the evidence synthesis community by coming to those. But other consortium members also have events and so on. There's of course What Works Global Summit coming up. What Works Global Summit coming up from Campbell later in October. There's What Works South Asia coming up from the office in South Asia in November. And these now start to be in-person events again. So Ottawa for What Works Global Summit, and What Works South Asia will be in Delhi. So do stay abreast of these events. And of course, there is, David, evidence to action
Yes.
by ICE in Ethiopia in July. Let's not forget the most important.
Yes, the week of July 24th, and you all are invited to Ethiopia to join the Africa Evidence to Action Conference. Okay, good. Eduardo, on the methods.
Yeah, sure. You know, if we think, let's try to approach this in this way. So suppose we were starting CEDIL again, or we wanted to continue the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years. And I was thinking now that actually, I think we did quite a good job at the beginning of identifying the right questions. I think we will still be working on this area. Maybe there will be some change based on the lessons that we learned. But, you know, the first question that we were trying to address was how are we going to crack, if you like, external validity? How are we going to be able to, you know, extract information from studies that is applicable more generally, right? And I think if one lessons, if you want, that we learn is that in this case, probably the answer is not going to come from more design or statistical sophistication, but it's coming from theory, right? So that's the message we want to give, and I think it's the area to explore in the future, like developing a middle range theory or learning more about projects rather than through statistics. In the case of complex intervention, I think the high level message would be that I think, again, looking at the scouting and frontier analogy, as I said, as a concluding remark to my presentation, you certainly want to scout new methods, but I think we do have a set of methods that, if combined together, they can do a pretty good job in addressing complex interventions. So I think we're already well equipped in that area. It's more a matter of using methods in a more flexible way. And in the case of machine learning, and again, I think so in this case, it's not something that we identified, but as I said, it emerged. But it's clearly an area that's going to develop more and more in the future. And I don't think there is a role necessarily for CEDIL in promoting, because it doesn't need promotion. But I think what we'll need is direction, and direction in the sense of developing a way which is useful and answering useful questions. And secondly, that I would say that in a way that is ethically respectful and not harmful. And so I think that's where maybe there is a role in the future for an organization like CEDIL. But you know, thinking retrospectively, I think we look at the right question. I think we still want you know, if I had to continue, I think we would be on the right track. I mean, we should continue work on these areas.
Okay. Yes, Rebecca. Yes.
Four things. Yeah, I'll be very quick. Early and ongoing stakeholder engagement and communication through the life cycle of the project and program, where it's embedded in the very design. Taking a very strategic approach to this area, which is politically aware. You're constantly revisiting and adapting that strategic approach. The importance of co-creation in partnership with decision makers, and finally the importance of defining what impact means and monitoring, measuring, and documenting that.
Okay, thank you. And Sean, lastly, what last word do FCDO have for it?
Gosh, that feels like a huge honor. So you know, I think the first two words that I'd say is thank you. Right. Okay. Thank you for today. Thank you for the conference. Thank you for all your hard work. Secondly, I would say, you know, this is a very particular financial situation that we're in right now. I think everybody is aware of that. Within government, we talk quite a bit about a 0.5 world and a 0.7 world. the reality is we need to be creative in terms of how we develop our understanding of innovative methods right now. You know, Howard pointed to some great opportunities of how we remain connected with the sector, how we continue to be creative and innovative. But right now, you know, in the current financial situation, we are not able to invest in the way that we have done in the past. And that, you know, that is sad, and it's frustrating for civil servants, but we need your help, right? We need your help to continue to be creative and innovative. We need your help grappling with some of those challenges and areas that we need to get better at, such as big data and how we really harness that in evaluations. Geospatial mapping, absolutely fascinating, the art of the possible there in evaluative work. And particularly, you know, in our organisation, this is something where there's huge amounts of potential. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, you know, that understanding influencing, you know, being able to evaluate, assess, you know, really draw out the impact of influencing is another area. I will stop there because I'm conscious of the clock, but back to you, David.
Thank you very much. It has been an interesting journey for the almost 5 years being the chair of the CEDIL Advisory Board and shepherding all this type of work, you know, meeting and working in different conferences. It has been a very good ride. We have about a month to go, and we want to thank you all for participating. We have the feedback that we have put on you, and everybody is going to receive email for you to give us feedback. Those who wants to download the poll, you can look at the chat session. The poll is there. You can also find it. We thank you all, and on behalf of CEDIL Advisory Board, I would like to say to the management and the research team, thank you. Good job done. Thank you very much.